Hello, welcome to Newscentre. With me, Parikshit Luthra. The World Bank has revised upward its FY23 GDP forecast for India to 6.9% from its earlier forecast of 6.5%. The improvement is being attributed to robust economic activities in India. While it is confident about Indian economy's ability to withstand global shocks, the World Bank has revised its GDP estimate from FY24 downward from 7% to 6.6%. On the inflation front, the World Bank expects inflation to remain above 7% in FY23, but expects it to slip to 5.2% in FY24. I caught up with World Bank's India head, Auguste Kouame, and senior economist Dhruv Sharma to understand more about the bank's predictions on India's growth. Here's that interview.
It will spill over to India less than it might have spilled over to India if India were not in the position where it is today. So there will be global tension, there will be global disruptions, and in fact those disruptions and negative growth development in other countries are going to intensify, we think, next year. They're already present this year and they're going to intensify next year. But why are they not impacting India as much as one would have thought? Well, first, India is a large country, a large population with a large consumption, domestic consumption. So that provides some basis for growth to happen even when exports are not dynamic. Second, India, through the responses that it put in place last year, coming out of COVID and with the beginning of the war in Ukraine, these measures, both on the fiscal side and on the monetary policy side, have proven that India can be fairly resilient. And India has also taken some measures to mitigate the impact of the global development on the vulnerable people through the direct benefit transfer, as well as through, for example, the PLI, which provide incentive to firms to continue investing. So we've seen investment doing fairly okay. And we've seen foreign direct investment also doing fairly okay. In this context, and in the context where India is also encouraging firms to invest in green economy, in renewable energy, and India is also positioning itself as a global manufacturing place for investment, looking for friendshoring or offshoring. There is a reason to think that India's economy will be, yes, impacted by these global adverse development like any country, but it will be impacted less than it will have without these conditions having been put in place.
All right. Dhruv, in the July-September quarter, we've seen GDP contraction to 6.3%, dragged down by manufacturing and mining specifically. What would be your outlook as far as manufacturing goes, and what more can be done to boost the manufacturing share in the GDP?
Thank you for that question. Look, India's economy performed reasonably well over the last quarter. A large part of that strength was due to domestic demand. Domestic demand, private consumption and investment were quite resilient to developments overseas and within the country as well. The government, industrial growth, manufacturing, these are important sectors of the economy. We are seeing a lot of strength actually in construction. That is helping industrial growth. That's helping the industry sector. What the measures that Auguste just mentioned related to supporting the PLI schemes and others, these will all help manufacturing. We'll see some of that evidence come into play later in the year. The PLI scheme closed earlier this year, so we hope to see some of that effect on the sector later this year.
Right, but we're also seeing a slow pickup in PLI schemes, Dhruv. While some of the PLI schemes have generated investments, others are yet to take off. Why do you think that is so?
Look, these schemes aren't, it takes a while for a pickup to happen. Part of the reason is that you need policy credibility and confidence, and I think we are seeing signs of that. Over the last 10 years or so, there has been an increase in confidence in the Indian economy. So while we might see a slow pickup right now, I don't think that is something that excuse me, we're too concerned about. Over the next few months, we'll be watching this closely, and we expect to see some results there.
Right. Auguste, as we take steps, as India takes steps to mitigate the impact of the global economic crisis, how should we ensure that growth is not impacted? And if there are certain factors that India needs to critically watch out for in the next few months, what would those be?
Well, thank you for the question. Growth will be impacted. I mean, growth is the sum total of everything happening in the economy, right? So whatever happens domestically or globally, it will, one way or the other, affect growth. So, and that's why we're forecasting growth at 6.6% next year, which is very good compared to where the world will be, compared to other forecasts for other countries, but it will still be a decline compared to the 6.9% of this year.
It's also lower than your previous forecast for FY24.
Indeed, it is. You know, for FY24, we were forecasting 7% before. Now we're forecasting 6.6%. But it's important to note that the average forecast for FY23 and FY24 remains more or less the same. You know, so we've upgraded our growth forecast for FY23, whilst slightly reducing our forecast for FY24. But you know, the average for the 2 years is more or less the same, which means that India will be in the same place where it would be, according to our forecast, in FY24, despite the global environment. Now, what to watch for? Well, it's well known. You know, India is, as I said, has a large domestic economy, but it's also an economy that is increasingly exporting. So one thing to watch for is what is happening in the export market, in India's trading partners. If their growth are significantly declining, then it will affect demand for India's output.
Dhruv, do you see India well on the path of achieving the 6.4% fiscal deficit target?
Look, we're expecting fiscal consolidation over the next couple of years. The trajectory that we have is measured, and one of the reasons for that is that there are still vulnerabilities, and the government is taking care of those vulnerable households. So it isn't withdrawing the stimulus that it had put in place over the past couple of years at a very rapid pace, which is important to consider. We expect revenue performance to remain quite strong over the next couple of years as well. So, notwithstanding external shocks that may occur, might require another response, I think the measured pace of fiscal consolidation is expected by us.
Right. What has been the impact on the job sector across categories? What has been the kind of growth that we're seeing? Which sectors have been the most impacted as far as unemployment goes?
One dimension of employment that we should pay attention to is female labor force participation. As COVID hit the economy, everyone suffered. All workers suffered, and many workers lost their jobs. As the economy recovered in 2021, many workers were able to come back to work. But what we did not see is a resumption in female labor force participation. And given that female labor force participation in India is one of the lowest, it is something that we're paying very close attention to, and we hope that as growth picks up in the medium term, it will be accompanied by a higher level of participation of women in the labor force.
You've seen it falling?
Well, we're seeing it stagnating, which is not good news. With female labor force participation in the 20s, 20%, 23, 24%, it's really one of the lowest among major economies. And, it needs to reach 60%. So we're really very far from where it should be. And we're very passionate about it because we think that if female labor force participation increases, it will create more jobs, including for men.
Now, in terms of inflation, you have pegged inflation, retail inflation at 7.1% in the World Bank latest update for India. How concerned are you about the inflation trajectory, and do you think India will be able to bring it within the RBI's tolerance band?
Our projection, as you said, is 7.1 for this fiscal year. Our projection for the next fiscal year is 5.1. So we're expecting inflation to come back within the tolerance range of 2 to 6%. A part of that is a reflection of our assessment that food price pressures will ease over the next few months. We're expecting a slight moderation on economic activity, which might sort of take the heat out of consumption activity as well a little bit. So confluence of these two factors and the fact that over the past 5-6 years, The RBI's inflation targeting framework has played a good role in anchoring inflation expectations.
But by which quarter in FY24 do you expect the inflation to come within the tolerance band?
So our forecast is for 5.1, which is an average over the whole fiscal year. So we're expecting a point estimate of which quarter is difficult to make, but we're expecting in the first half of next fiscal year for numbers to come within the tolerance rate. Excuse me.
Okay. Auguste, if I were to ask you about the budget, what can the budget now do to keep India on the growth trajectory and a higher growth path as well? For example, Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, has said that India has a potential to even go up to 9% GDP growth rate. When we're speaking about 8 or 9% GDP growth rate, are the current measures enough? What more needs to be done?
Right. Yes, India has a space to use the budget to achieve high growth. So we talked about the PLI. Now, the PLI is a budget measure. It gives incentives to firms, so it has fiscal implications. It means foregone revenues, or maybe it means direct outlays in some cases. But the government can do more, the budget can do more. Another thing that the budget could do is, as we talk about the green economy, the energy transition, the budget could provide incentives for firms to focus more on sectors that can help India become a global champion in the renewable energy sector. Yet another thing that the budget can do is how can the budget be used to make the LIFE initiative that the Prime Minister has championed and announced, how can the budget be used to make it real? How can the budget be used to give you incentives to change your lifestyle? So there could be some tax measures there. There could be some incentives provided through the budget to make people feel, they need to switch the light off, or they'd rather walk rather than drive to go from point A to point B. Then yet another thing that the budget can do is how can the direct benefit transfers that are being provided through the budget and using the ADHA system, how can it be used to provide resources for the vulnerable and poor, not just to consume, but also to build opportunities for them to participate in the production process in the future? How can the resources be used not just to consume for today, but also to invest in human capital for tomorrow? So there are a lot of things that the budget can do. Now, one last thing is also to ensure that the budget is consistent with the monetary policy, because we talked about inflation going down, which is good news. But for that, the budget also has a role to play. It means, perhaps reducing overall expenditures so the government doesn't put too much pressure on demand. So whilst you do more in certain areas, you may want to do less in other areas. If you're going to do more in some areas, how can you use the budget to orient those expenditures toward what you want the economy to look like in the future? So there are a lot of things the budget can do.